Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to discuss free trade, especially in the context of globalization. We have a context here after the creation of the WTO, which is totally different than it was before its creation. We have models here for free trade agreements that are based on the NAFTA, not other agreements that, in my opinion, are more beneficial for the environment and for society as a whole.
And it's a trade agreement with Jordan. There are certainly specific issues to Jordan. I'd like to preface that, though, with a review of how we got to where we are in terms of where Canada's interests lie as a society, not merely our trade in goods, because all of these debates usually rest on the notion that if you have questions about new trade agreements, you're against trade with another nation. I mean, trade, I remember once the venerable senator who had been our Minister of Agriculture for many years, and he commented, trade isn't new. What do you think Marco Polo was doing? So we've certainly had trade for a very, very long time, and no one is against trade. In the context of global trade, we've seen a remarkable transition. We used to live in a world of tariff barriers, frankly, that allowed the Canadian economy to grow to be as strong as we are now. Tariff barriers in the post-Second World War era were targeted, and we began to see them coming down. The effort to say that one country must not discriminate against another began to bring the pendulum in a very different direction than what we had seen before the Second World War. These efforts led to the creation of the GATT, and in the first instance, the GATT was quite restricted in terms of focusing on trade in goods, which is what I think most Canadians understand we mean when we talk about trade agreements. Trade in goods, our ability to buy and sell, the ability of our neighbors to buy and sell to us. This trade in goods is something that has been handled by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade for a very long time. Now, things changed substantially in the 1990s. It was a 9-year negotiation, as I recall. I think it's from memory. I'm recalling a 9-year negotiation of the Uruguay round to bring forward a new version, an updated version of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And within that new agreement, to do some things that had not been done before. So it was the advent of looking beyond goods, to look at trades and services, to look beyond those things that were completely commercial and make changes that actually had implications for culture, for society overall, environment, labor. In other words, the approach of the trade world began to impinge on other aspects of society. They became not just trade agreements, but agreements that actually changed the relationship, a very fundamental relationship between citizens and their government versus the relationship of corporations and those governments. And if there was a time when we had too many tariff barriers, if there was a time when we were perhaps too protectionist, that time has long passed. And we now have seen the pendulum swing so far that the so-called liberalization of trade is not just advancing the flow of goods in the interests of a dogma of globalization, which allows more and more multinational corporations to be able to dictate policy, to have a greater role, and arguably to have a greater role than the citizens. Now, backing up and looking at the model to which I referred earlier, the NAFTA model. The NAFTA model has dictated a great deal since we entered into that agreement. And one of probably the most egregious part of the NAFTA model is the investor-state provisions, which allow a corporation based in a country that's part of that trade agreement. In the case of NAFTA, of course, we're talking about corporations based in the U.S. or Mexico, to have the ability to sue the Canadian government if we pass a law that they don't like. Now, let me back up and say that the Chapter 11 of NAFTA, the investor state provisions, not only allow a foreign corporation from the US or Mexico to sue the Canadian government at the federal level. This provision actually allows a foreign corporation, which I should mention, of course, that a domestic corporation doesn't have the right to sue our government. So it gives preferential treatment to foreign corporations to sue Canada if there's a regulation passed by this House. So in a democratic House of Assembly, we can pass a law which is untouchable by a Canadian corporation, but for which a foreign corporation can sue us for damages. Now, not only under the investor state provisions can under NAFTA a U.S. or Mexican corporation sue us, they can sue the federal level, they can sue a province, they can sue a municipal government. And we've seen the examples under Chapter 11 of NAFTA for quite some time that have allowed laws passed by this House to actually be repealed because of a Chapter 11 challenge. I refer specifically to Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia, which sued the Canadian government for costs and damages when this House chose to restrict access to a manganese-based gasoline additive that was the health community warned neurotoxic, which the environmental community warned was a danger to the environment, and which the car manufacturers said we don't want in our cars because it compromises the catalytic converters and it hurts our warranties, and we need action on this. The fact that even when the factual basis for governmental action is not in question, the fact that there is no notion that the action taken by this government was in any way motivated by trade discrimination. In other words, we weren't trying to give preferential treatment to a Canadian industry or Canadian product. It is sufficient, according to the lawyer who represented Ethel Corporation, the Canadian lawyer Barry Appleton from Toronto, said at the time that it wouldn't matter if you were adding liquid plutonium to children's breakfast cereal. If you banned it, and another country, and the people who made liquid plutonium for children's breakfast cereal said they'd lost their profit through that action, they could sue us. So this is just as I may have taken too long on the specific example, but to make the point that the trade agreements have gone too far. We are no longer talking about access to goods and services. We're talking about changing the fundamentals of the relationship. The primary relationship between a government should be to the citizens who elect the members of Parliament who serve in that government. There should be no superior rights of redress to a foreign corporation. And we've seen time and time again that this has happened. The most recent, and I think quite egregious example, was when the Prime Minister chose to preempt a complaint by a forest company against actions by the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. In that case, Abitibi Bowwaters was the holder of what had been a 99-year lease that allowed them at bargain basement prices to have access to a large area of forest on the condition that they ran a pulp mill. And into the bargain, and believe it or not, a 99-year lease, had been thrown water rights and other ancillary benefits. And when the province of Newfoundland and Labrador said, we're not letting you close your mill and sell off everything you had under that lease, which would include water rights and the forest itself, we're telling you you don't have access to those, the foreign corporation sued, and the Prime Minister chose in that instance to castigate the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, pay out tens of millions of dollars to Abitibi Bowwater, and say we don't want this to ever happen again. These investor state provisions are creeping into all of these so-called bilateral investment agreements, the BITs. We're seeing it creep in all around. We just heard the Prime Minister return from Beijing, very thrilled to have a new proposed trade agreement with China that would include these very provisions that allow a foreign government to sue us. Now, in this instance, we're looking at a proposed agreement with Jordan. There are many good and substantial reasons to improve relationships with Jordan. Jordan is within the Middle East, has a reputation, a long-standing role as one of the Arab states which has been most stable, least xenophobic, certainly most supportive of the existence of the State of Israel of most of the nations in that region. Jordan has many things to recommend it. Democracy is not among them. It's a monarchy. But certainly King Hussein of Jordan was always seen as the late King Hussein of Jordan was always seen as someone of enormous, and I have to say I was always impressed with his a sense of wisdom from the man. And his queen, Queen Noor, was a very strong advocate for the environment. And I had the great honor of serving on a commission called the Earth Charter Commission, which was co-chaired by Mikhail Gorbachev and Morris Strong, and had the great good fortune to get to know Princess Basma of Jordan, who was King Hussein's sister. So I have, as I approach this, a sense of Jordan's place in the world and of a sense of, albeit small, personal connection. But when you look at the implications of this particular trade agreement with Jordan, I don't think we should rush into it without having much better, good and substantial answers for a couple of key points. We have seen numerous commentators point out that the Canada-Jordan Free Trade Agreement could create free license to greater human smuggling, that we would see an increased flow of essentially of foreign workers into Jordanian factories, and this could also undermine labor rights in Jordan. When we enter into a negotiation such as this, I would suggest a couple of steps that I think we tend to miss. The first step is, how do we build a stronger relationship with this country? And you can fill in the blanks. In this case, Jordan. A few days ago, we were talking about Panama. How do we build good links? Now, Canada traditionally has been able to build good links through a robust Department of Foreign Affairs. We had skilled and qualified diplomats working in these countries. We had people who spoke local languages, who spent time getting to know the local NGO community, who were able, in other words, to provide a context within which we dealt with nations. The importance of our foreign affairs outreach has been, in recent years, quite diminished. We've closed embassies, closed consulates around the world, and that means that our reach is reduced. It's important when we have a relationship with a country, whether Panama or Jordan or China, that the relationship be built on many pillars. One is, of course, the diplomatic one to which I refer. Another is greater social interaction, cultural exchanges. This government has shut down all the programs that dealt with allowing Canadian artists to perform overseas, thus building stronger relationships through our culture. We also need to build relationships built on the concept not of the model of the NAFTA agreement, but looking more at the model from the European Union. Now, in that model, all nations within the EU, when they undertook to be part of that shared common market, had to accept the toughest levels of environmental and labor standards of any one of the member countries. This is a key principle that is completely lacking from NAFTA. Under NAFTA, there are no requirements to meet higher standards. The most we got out of the language of NAFTA was that it would be unacceptable to see a country lower its environmental standards in order to advance trade. So there's a very large difference between NAFTA saying you're not allowed to lower your standards for the environment to attract more trade, and the completely different approach of the EU, which is you must raise your standards. You must meet, generally speaking, Germany has the highest environmental standards, so other countries had to raise themselves up to equal German standards. Some of those countries were poorer, so there was a transfer of resources to help them do that. If you're looking at models around the world to find ways to use that trade pillar to advance other issues, then you would never follow the NAFTA model. It would be the worst possible way to go. You would follow and look at where are the best examples around the world. Let's follow those. So if we have relationships on the basis of trade, those relationships should include raising the bar and saying to foreign corporations, I think we need to look at a code of conduct even enshrined in law internationally on the same way that we protect intellectual property rights. We know how to design regimes, such as the TRIPS agreement, which require that all nations on earth proactively pass legislation to protect intellectual property rights and give all countries the ability to search and seize goods passing at the border if they don't meet the qualifications for intellectual property rights. We know how to do these things. What if we were to say, for instance, no goods at a border are allowed to pass if they have involved child labor? We could say, why let goods come to a border if they've involved the destruction of precious ecosystems? Instead, our trade mantra is that we don't interfere with PPMs, process and production methods. But I ask you, what is an intellectual property infringement other than a process and production method? It means you've got the product you got by stealing someone else's intellectual property. Why is it a greater offense under the trade regime to steal intellectual property than to exploit children, destroy forests, or increase greenhouse gas emissions? So if you look at the global governance of trade, there's tremendous potential there for good. There's tremendous potential to harness the ability that has been used to protect intellectual property rights and use those kinds of agreements to protect labor standards, to protect children, to protect ecosystems, to advance a low-carbon economy. All of those things could be done, but again, they're not being done. So if you look at what we could do, for instance, to ensure that Canadian corporations or U.S. corporations or Dutch or Chinese or whatever, that to participate in the GATT, we should have a global agreement on corporate behavior that says all corporations operating within this trade zone, which is basically everybody except Cuba, to do so, you have to meet minimum standards. We want to ensure you're all meeting proper labor standards, proper environmental standards. Then no corporation would be disadvantaged by having to take these standards on because all corporations would have a level playing field. Would actually be something quite progressive coming from the rules that have been learned through the development of the GATT, through the development of the WTO, through the TRIPS agreement, through the General Agreement on Trade and Services, and so on. We haven't done that here. We have before us an agreement which follows the traditional, typical model. It gives investment rights. It says a few nice words about it. I mean, there is more of an environmental assessment review. We have had a review of what the Canada-Jordan free trade negotiations would mean. There are some agreements to work together on environmental issues, but we still have the looming problems of reduced labor standards within Jordan, the risk of human trafficking, and the fact that we have skewed the relationship that we have with other nations to the effect that it appears that nothing matters other than trade. And and I suppose you can now sense, Mr. Speaker, that there's a theme to what I'm saying. We're not against trade, we're not against new trade agreements, but the balance must be achieved so that our relationship with other countries in the world is based on multilateralism, based on internationalism, that it always recognizes the priority of citizens in a country to make decisions and have them binding, that it doesn't give superior rights to corporations over citizens, that it rebalances the importance of diplomacy, of exchange, of fair trade in goods, and that it insists the rules that govern our trade agreements constantly reinforce and elevate the nature of our relationships, not put us in a situation where the populace of various countries push back. We will see come before this House before too long the comprehensive economic trade agreement with the European Union. And as I've been talking about EU trade agreements, how ironic is it that we're not seeing in the drafts of that agreement a replication of the EU model, but far more one that more looks like the NAFTA model with the benefits that will largely accrue to European pharmaceutical companies and so on. But that agreement isn't before us yet. I certainly don't oppose this bill and this treaty getting to committee. I think we need to see it improved. I think relationships with Jordan are important, but they must be much richer, more complex, and more nuanced than advancing agreements and relationships with Jordan through a trade agreement that fails to live up to its potential. We must revisit this, protecting the rights of workers and protecting the environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.